At the Thanksgiving table, I was sitting right there when my daughter's in-laws placed a surrogacy contract in front of her, forcing her to carry a child for her own sister-in-law. Her mother-in-law said, "It's your duty." Her husband coldly added, "Don't be selfish." His father nodded as if everything was already decided. Her sister-in-law looked straight at her and smiled. "I'll raise the baby as my own." But they didn't know. When my daughter calmly circled one clause and slid it back across the table, that smile vanished and the entire room fell silent. "I appreciate you being here with me. One small thing before we start, leave me a comment and tell me, have you ever trusted someone with your family, only to find out they had a plan you never saw coming? Yes or no is enough. I read everyone." A quick note. Some details in this story have been shaped for narrative purposes. The truth behind it is what I hope stays with you. Most families pass the gravy at Thanksgiving. Mine passed a 22-page contract, printed on paper heavy enough to bury someone with. I noticed the folder before I noticed the turkey. Cream-colored cardstock centered beside the serving platter, like a place setting nobody had ordered. The overhead light was too bright. Someone had replaced the dimmer bulb with a 100-watt that turned the dining room into something closer to a deposition chamber. 8 chairs for what was supposed to be a small family dinner. I counted them twice because counting is what I do. I am 60 years old. I spent 20 years as a private investigator and the last 3 as a legal advisor, and in all that time, I never once walked into a room without cataloging the exits, the threats, and the objects that did not belong. That folder did not belong. Gideon Harmon sat at the head of the table with the posture of a man who considered every room his courtroom. 63 years old, owner of 3 pharmacies across Franklin County. Hands folded in front of him like a judge about to deliver a verdict he had written before the trial started. His wife, Linda, 60, a homemaker who had organized church fundraisers for 22 years with campaign manager precision, had hugged me at the front door 3 seconds longer than necessary. I could still smell her perfume on my collar gardenia, applied heavily the way people apply perfume when they want you to remember they were kind to you before the conversation turns. "Walt, good to have the whole family together," Gideon said. "All of us." He emphasized the last 2 words. I filed that. Linda touched my arm from across the breadbasket. "We're so blessed this year, so blessed." In 20 years of work, I learned that people who announce blessings are usually about to ask for a sacrifice. Ryan Harmon, 34. A pharmacist managing the downtown branch of his father's chain sat to Gideon's left. He extended a handshake when I arrived. That felt like a man trying to remember if he had locked the car. Now he was staring at his plate like it owed him money, pushing a piece of sweet potato back and forth with his fork. The sound of stainless steel scraping porcelain filled the silence between Linda's blessings. Vivian Harmon, 38, Gideon's daughter and owner of a wellness spa on Maple Street, arrived in a pearl-colored blouse and the careful composure of a woman who had rehearsed her role in the bathroom mirror. She sat beside Ryan and kept touching the napkin in her lap, folding and refolding the corner like someone practicing patience they did not naturally have. And at the far end of the table, as far from Gideon as geometry allowed, sat my son, Derek Calloway, 35, a real estate agent who had not closed a sale in 4 months, had the posture of a man trying to become invisible. He had not looked at me since I walked in. He had not looked at anyone. His water glass was full, his wine glass was empty, and his left knee was bouncing under the table hard enough to rattle the silverware. I smelled the turkey, rosemary and sage properly brined. Someone had spent real time on this bird. I smelled cinnamon from a candle on the sideboard and the faint chemical sweetness of furniture polish on the oak table. The table was polished for company. This was a performance. You fathers out there who have sat at a table where the knives were already out before the turkey was carved, you know what this room smelled like beneath the cinnamon and sage. It smelled like preparation. It smelled like a room that had been set for a purpose that had nothing to do with gratitude. I picked up my water glass. The condensation was cold against my palm and I held it there, letting the sensation anchor me the way cold evidence anchors a case, something real in a room full of theater. Then I looked across the table at my daughter, Claire Harmon, 31, an ICU nurse whose 12-hour shifts had taught her to read a room faster than most people read a menu. She sat with her hands flat on either side of her plate, not eating, not drinking, not performing, just still. The kind of stillness I recognized from trauma wards and interrogation rooms. Not calm. Containment. She caught my eye for exactly 1 second. Not surprise, not fear, recognition. She already knew what the folder contained. My daughter had walked into this room prepared, and she came anyway. That told me two things. Whatever was inside that cream-colored folder was bad enough to prepare for, and Claire had decided that facing it was better than pretending it did not exist. She got that from her mother. "Claire, you look so healthy," Vivian said, reaching across the table to touch Claire's wrist. "You really do. Doesn't she look healthy, Mom?" "She absolutely does," Linda said, glowing. They were appraising her, not complimenting her. I have watched people appraise property for 20 years. I know the difference. A compliment lives in the voice. An appraisal lives in the eyes. And both Vivian and Linda were looking at my daughter the way a contractor looks at a lot, measuring yield, not beauty. I tasted the cranberry sauce. Too sweet. Store-bought, dressed up with orange zest to look homemade. Like everything else in this room, something ordinary wearing an expensive costume. I looked at the folder again. The cardstock was heavy textured, the kind you order from a printer who does wedding invitations. Someone had paid to make this feel like a gift. That cream-colored folder was not a decoration. And in 20 years of reading evidence, I have learned one thing about documents printed on expensive paper. They are never gifts. They are always cages built to look like frames. Whoever placed that folder beside the turkey wanted my daughter to feel honored when she opened it. I intended to make sure she felt something else entirely. But that Thanksgiving table was Thursday. Let me take you back 2 days to the morning I should have started listening. Wednesday, my kitchen, 6:14 on the coffee pot timer, because Margaret said it 20 years ago. And I have not changed it because changing it would mean I have accepted that she is gone. The blue mug she painted at a ceramics class in 2011 sits on the second shelf. I have not moved it. Her chair at the table still holds the dent her body pressed into the cushion across 31 years of mornings. I have not moved that either. You men who have lost a wife and kept her chair exactly where it was, you know, this is not sentimentality. It is a negotiation with the universe. Move the chair and the deal is final. Margaret Calloway had been a school librarian who cataloged books the way she cataloged suspicions, quietly, completely, and in a notebook she kept behind the third shelf in my study. She died of a stroke 3 years ago at 57. That morning, I sat across from her empty chair and remembered the last useful thing she ever said to me about my son-in-law. "I don't like Ryan," she told me one evening in the 2021, folding a dish towel into thirds the way she folded everything with unnecessary precision. Not because he's bad, because he's too cautious. Cautious people are hiding the math. I investigated Ryan for 3 weeks after that, pulled his financials through a contact at the county clerk's office, checked his pharmacy license, his college transcripts, his credit history. Found nothing, or rather, found nothing I was willing to see. I closed the file. It was the only investigation I abandoned in 20 years of professional work. And I abandoned it because my wife's instinct did not fit inside the evidence box I had built for it. Margaret never mentioned Ryan again. She did not need to. She had said what she said, and she trusted that I would eventually find my way back to it. She was right. She was always right, and she died before I could tell her so. I drank my coffee. It tasted the way Wednesday coffee always tastes, like the last quiet morning before something you cannot name. The phone rang at 7:40. "Claire. Dad, you're coming tomorrow, right?" Her voice had the flat rhythm of someone reading from a script she did not write. "Ryan's parents will be here. Just a small dinner, nothing special." Nothing special? My daughter has never once in her life used those two words together. Claire Harmon does not do nothing special. She works 12-hour ICU shifts where the difference between special and nothing is a ventilator setting and 4 seconds. She says nothing special the way witnesses say it, when the special part is exactly what they are trying to bury. "I'll be there," I said. "Good." A pause. The kind of pause that has furniture in it, something she wanted to say, blocking the hallway. "Dad, yeah. Just bring your coat, the good one." She hung up. I held the phone for 11 seconds. My daughter had just told me to dress well for a nothing special dinner. In 20 years of detective work, I have never once heard an innocent person give wardrobe instructions. Thursday morning, Thanksgiving. The highway from Grandview Heights to Upper Arlington is 12 miles of bare November trees and a sky the color of old cement. I drove with the radio off because radio is for people who want company. I wanted silence. Silence is where I do my best thinking. And what I was thinking about was the way Claire's voice sounded like a hostage reading proof of life. 2 blocks from her house, I pulled to the shoulder and opened the gate camera app on my phone. Claire gave me the login after a break-in scare last March, and I had never removed it. 6 vehicles in the driveway. 6. For what my daughter called a small dinner. How many of you have pulled into a driveway and known before your engine was off, before your shoes touched the pavement, that the people inside had already decided something about you? I identified each car from the camera's wide angle. Gideon's black Cadillac Escalade always parked like it owned the lot. Linda's silver Lexus SUV, reverse parked for a quick exit, a habit I recognized because it is my habit too. Ryan's white sedan from the pharmacy lot. A blue Honda I did not recognize. Derek's car, my own son, who had not mentioned he was coming, and a rental sedan with a Columbus Airport sticker on the rear bumper. Someone had flown in for a turkey dinner my daughter called nothing special. I sat in my car for 4 minutes with the engine off. The heater ticked as it cooled. November air crept through the window seals, and I could feel it on the backs of my hands dry sharp. The kind of cold that makes you aware of your own skin. I smelled wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney and the faint sweetness of dead leaves composting in the gutter. I counted what I knew. Claire's voice was scripted. The dinner was overstaffed. Someone had traveled. My son had not told me he would be there. And Margaret, 3 years dead and still sharper than me, had warned me about the cautious man at the center of this family. I opened the car door. The November air hit me full in the chest, carrying someone else's Thanksgiving on the wind-roasted garlic wood smoke. The ghost of a holiday that still belonged to normal families. I straightened my coat. The good one, the way my daughter asked. 20 years as a detective taught me one rule above all others: never walk into a room where you are the only person who does not know why you are there. I was not walking in blind. I was walking in as the person they assumed was blind. There is a difference, and that difference has kept me alive more than once. I walked through that front door the way I have walked through every door for 20 years. Shoulders level, hands visible, eyes on everything. The foyer smelled like roasted garlic and cinnamon, and something underneath both the sharp, clean scent of new paper. Have you ever counted how many times a man says the word family when he is about to use yours as currency? I counted 11. Gideon rose from the head of the table after the appetizer plates were cleared. He buttoned his jacket, a gesture I have seen in courtrooms more than dining rooms, and began speaking in the measured cadence of a man who had rehearsed in his bathroom mirror until the pauses landed in the right places. This family, he said, has been through more than most. Vivian has carried a burden that no woman should carry alone. 4 rounds, years of trying, and through all of it, this family held together because that is what family does. Family. He used it like mortar, packing it between every sentence to make the structure feel solid. I watched his hands, steady, practiced. The hands of a man who had given this speech before, possibly to a different audience, possibly with different words, but the same architecture. Family is the one investment that always pays back, he continued. Vivian has fought longer than any woman should have to fight, and family, real family, steps forward. I looked at Ryan. His left leg was bouncing beneath the tablecloth hard enough to ripple the water in his glass. He was staring at a fixed point on the wall behind my head, the 1,000-yard stare of a man who has been told where to sit and what not to say. Linda sat with her hands folded in her lap. I had noticed that posture before at Claire's wedding reception, when the seating chart was rearranged at the last minute and Linda said nothing for 45 minutes. Her tell. Folded hands meant the plan was already in motion and her job was to wait. Then Vivian spoke. 4 times, she said, and her voice cracked on the second word. 4 rounds of IVF, $187,000. Each time they told me it didn't work a part of me. She stopped, pressed her fingertips to her eyes. The pause lasted exactly 3 seconds, long enough to land short enough not to lose the room. You women who have ever sat at a holiday table and felt the room tilt, felt every smile sharpen into something with a point you already know what was coming next. Vivian's pain was real. I did not doubt that. 4 failed rounds of IVF will break anyone, but the delivery, the timing of the crack, the placement of the pause, the way her hand dropped from her face and found the napkin she had pre-positioned on her left side, that was choreography. I have watched witnesses rehearse on the stand for 20 years. I know the difference between a woman who is breaking and a woman who broke months ago and is now performing the memory of it for a specific audience. The specific audience was my daughter. I looked at Claire. She had not moved. Her hands were flat on the table. Her face was the face she wore during 12-hour ICU shifts when the patient was crashing and the protocol was clear, and the only acceptable response was stillness. She was not surprised. She was enduring. And while Gideon spoke and Vivian wept, and the room held its collective breath like a jury waiting for the verdict, my mind left the table. It went somewhere more useful. It went to my daughter. Claire at 14 sitting in the hallway outside my gastroenterologist's office with a medical textbook open on her lap. She had noticed my symptoms before I did the weight loss. The color in my face, the way I winced after coffee, and she had researched it herself because she did not trust me to take care of myself. She was right. Claire at 22, working triple overnight shifts at Riverside Methodist to cover her own nursing school tuition because she refused to let me take a second mortgage. I found out 6 months later. She had not told me because she knew I would insist, and she did not want me to insist. She wanted to handle it. Claire at 27, wiring Derek $8,000 at 3 in the morning because he called her crying about a debt he could not name. She did not ask a single question. She sent the money and called me the next day to make sure I had eaten breakfast. There are two kinds of people at a family dinner, those who serve the food and those who serve the verdict. That evening, my daughter was being served, and the people serving her had spent $187,000 on the credentials to do it. Gideon finished. The room was silent in the way rooms are silent after a sermon, not because the congregation is moved, but because no one is sure whether they are permitted to speak. Gideon looked at Linda. Linda looked at the folder. The cream-colored folder that had been sitting beside the turkey platter since before I arrived. She rose from her chair. She picked it up with both hands, and she walked around the table to Claire's side with the unhurried grace of a woman delivering a christening gift. "Claire, sweetheart," she said softly, "we have something we'd love to share with you, as a family." She placed it on the table beside the cranberry sauce, cream-colored cardstock, a small brass paperclip aligned on the corner of page 1, with the kind of care you give something you have been planning for longer than one holiday season. The paperclip caught the overhead light and threw a thin gold line across the tablecloth. The room went quiet. Not the quiet after a sermon, the quiet before a sentencing. Every person at that table knew what was inside that folder. Every person except, they believed me. They were wrong about that. And they were about to be wrong about much more. At TISA 2.2, Claire picked up the folder. She opened it the way she opens a patient chart in the ICU, steady hands, no expression reading for what will kill. She began reading aloud, one sentence per breath, the cadence of a woman trained to deliver devastating information to families at 4 in the morning without letting her voice shake. I had heard that voice before in hospital hallways on phone calls. In the measured way she told me Margaret's stroke was massive and there was nothing more they could do. My daughter reads horror the way other people read weather reports. It is the thing that makes her a great nurse and a terrifying opponent. The first 3 pages were architecture, gestational surrogacy agreement, parties of intent, medical protocols, hormone injections administered on a schedule determined by the intended mother's fertility specialist, dietary restrictions, exercise limitations, travel prohibited beyond a 2-hour radius of the designated medical facility without written consent. I listened and I watched. Ryan's leg accelerated under the tablecloth when Claire reached the hormone clause. His water glass trembled. He knew what those injections meant. He was a pharmacist. He understood dosages and side effects and the specific ways synthetic hormones alter a woman's body, and he was sitting 3 feet from his wife while she read a contract that would turn her into a pharmaceutical delivery system managed by his sister. Linda's hands tightened in her lap when Claire reached the financial section. A small contraction, knuckles whitening for less than a second before she smoothed them flat again. Her tell. The plan was proceeding, but the money part made her grip something. And Marcus Tully, 55, an estate lawyer whose forehead had begun to shine the moment the folder was opened, pressed a cocktail napkin to his temple when the indemnification language began. He sat 2 chairs from Gideon with the posture of a man calculating his exit. He was the one who drafted this document. The rental car with the airport sticker was his. Then Claire read the clause that changed everything. The gestational carrier hereby authorizes the intended mother to receive on her behalf all communications pertaining to medical care, prenatal testing, and clinical recommendations. On her behalf, my daughter, a woman who has kept strangers alive with her hands at 3 in the morning, who diagnosed my ulcer before my own doctor did, who can read a blood panel the way I read a crime scene, would not be allowed to receive her own test results. Every lab report, every ultrasound, every screening would route through Vivian. They were building a room around my daughter's body and handing someone else the only key. You nurses, you paramedics, you women who have held strangers' lives in your hands in the middle of the night. Imagine being told you are not permitted to hold your own medical chart. Imagine someone printing that sentence on expensive paper and calling it an agreement. "Honey, you don't need to read every word," Linda said softly, reaching toward Claire's arm. "It's all very standard. Marcus had professionals review it." Claire did not look up. She turned to page 4. "Let me tell you about contracts printed on expensive paper pages. 1 through 3 are the cathedral-high ceilings, stained glass. The word altruistic repeated like a hymn. Page 4 is always where they keep the knife." Claire's reading pace did not change. Her voice stayed flat, clinical, controlled. But I saw her index finger press harder against the cardstock, the pad of her finger whitening against the cream-colored page the way a hand whitens on a steering wheel before impact. The intended mother reserves the right at her sole discretion to request termination of carriage prior to 24 weeks gestation should genetic screening results fall outside preferred parameters. She read it once. The room heard it once. And once was enough. Preferred parameters. I turned those 2 words over in my mind the way I turn evidence looking for the weight, the angle, the intent behind the language. Sex selection. Genetic filtering. A clause that gave Vivian the legal authority to end a pregnancy inside my daughter's body if the child did not meet specifications. Not medical necessity. Not health risk. Specifications. A return policy printed on wedding invitation cardstock and tucked between the dietary restrictions and the travel radius. "That's just protective language," Gideon said, clearing his throat with the practiced casualness of a man who has rehearsed his dismissals as carefully as his speeches. "Standard in any agreement. No one expects to use it." I looked at Vivian. Her face did not move. Not a flinch, not a blink, not the smallest adjustment of the muscles around her eyes or the corners of her mouth. The woman who had cried about 4 failed IVF cycles 15 minutes ago, who had pressed her fingertips to her eyelids with the timing of an actress hitting. Her mark sat perfectly still, while my daughter read a clause that would give her sole authority to terminate a pregnancy based on genetic preference. She was not surprised. She had read this clause before tonight. She had not merely read it, she had requested it. Someone had underlined the word irrevocably in fine black pen on the original, and I recognized the handwriting. It matched the thank you card Vivian had sent after Claire's birthday dinner in September, the same careful left-leaning script. The woman who wept about wanting a child had written a return policy for a child that did not meet specifications. And she was sitting at my daughter's Thanksgiving table, watching my daughter discover it with the patience of someone who has already calculated every possible response. I tasted the wine in my glass. It had gone warm. Everything in that room had gone warm. The air, the light. The pretense that this was a family dinner. The only cold thing left was the document in my daughter's hands and the understanding settling into my chest like ice water. This was not a request. It was an acquisition. And the people acquiring had been planning it long before the turkey was ordered. Claire closed the folder with one hand the way she closes a chart on a patient she has already decided to save. She did not slam it. She did not push it. She placed both hands on the cream-colored cardstock and slid it back across the table toward Linda with the unhurried precision of a woman returning something that was never hers. The brass paperclip caught the candlelight one last time. Then she stood. "I won't be signing this," she said. Her voice was level, the same voice she uses to tell a family that the ventilator is the only thing keeping their father alive, and it is time to make a decision. "I won't be discussing it, and I want everyone at this table to understand something." She looked at each of them. Gideon, Linda, Vivian, Ryan, Derek, Tully. 1 second per face the way a witness identifies people in a lineup. "I heard what each of you said tonight. I will not forget it." The room did not breathe. Gideon's hands stayed folded. Ryan's legs stopped bouncing for the first time all evening. Derek stared at the tablecloth, as if the pattern contained instructions for disappearing. Then Linda's composure broke. Not loudly, Linda does not do loudly. A fracture, not an explosion. Her jaw tightened, her folded hands separated, and her voice dropped to the register people use when they have practiced being patient and have run out of practice. "After everything this family has done for you, Claire," she said. "After everything." Claire did not respond. She picked up her coat from the back of her chair. I stood, walked around the table, and kissed my daughter's forehead in front of all of them, not because she needed comfort, but because I wanted every person in that room to see a gesture that cost nothing and meant everything, placed next to a document that cost a fortune and meant nothing at all. We walked out together. The November air hit us at the door, and I could feel it on my neck, sharp and clean, the opposite of everything inside that house. You fathers who have ever walked beside your daughter, out of a room full of people who just tried to buy her, you know that the walk to the car is the longest hallway in the world, 12 steps from the front door to the driveway. I counted them, because counting is the only thing that keeps my hands from shaking when the rest of me wants to go back inside and dismantle that table with everyone still sitting at it. Claire was silent for 11 miles. She sat in the passenger seat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the highway, and she did not speak and she did not cry. That silence was not defeat. It was the silence of a woman deciding her next move. I recognized it because I had taught it to her, or maybe Margaret had. Maybe Margaret had taught both of us, and I was only now learning the lesson. I dropped Claire at her house. She squeezed my hand once at the curb, tight brief the kind of grip that says everything a sentence cannot, and walked inside without looking back. I drove home. I could not sleep. The house was dark, and the furnace clicked on and off with the rhythm of an argument it was having with December. I tasted the leftover coffee I had reheated, bitter burnt, the flavor of a kitchen that has not had a woman's hand in it for 3 years. I sat in my study and stared at the bookshelves Margaret had organized by subject, because she was a librarian, and librarians cannot tolerate disorder, even in their own homes. At 2 a.m, I stood up to pull a legal reference book from the third shelf Ohio contract law, a volume I had not touched since my last surrogacy adjacent case in 2018. I reached behind the row of spines to grip the binding. Something fell. A small notebook spiral-bound the kind Margaret bought in packs of 6 from the school supply closet every September. It had been wedged behind the book spine inward, invisible unless you reached past the front row. It hit the carpet with a sound like a whisper landing in an empty room. I picked it up, I opened it. Margaret's handwriting, small, precise. Librarian neat, the penmanship of a woman who had spent 30 years writing catalog cards and lesson plans and birthday inscriptions in books she gave to children who could not afford their own. But this was not a diary. This was not a grocery list or a lesson plan or a letter she never sent. This was a case file. There is a particular kind of grief that arrives not when you lose someone, but when you discover they were fighting a war you did not know about, and they lost it alone. Dates, names, dollar amounts, arrows drawn in blue ink connecting entries the way I connect evidence on a whiteboard. She had started in August, 4 months before her stroke. 4 months of questions she was asking alone in this study while I sat in the kitchen and noticed nothing. 4 months of investigation conducted by a school librarian who had learned enough from living with a detective for 30 years to build her own case and who had not told me because I had dismissed her instinct about Ryan and she had decided to prove it herself. I turned to the first page. The first name she had written was Dr. Howard Finch, my daughter's obstetrician. Next to it, a number $28,000, and below that, in smaller letters, underlined once with the careful pressure of a woman who wanted to make sure this line would survive, even if the rest did not. Why isn't there Dr. Claire's doctor? Ont et bi Martins, Eira Respafburl. My wife had been asking the right questions. She had run out of time before she found the answers. I had not. I sat with Margaret's notebook until 4 a.m. Every page raised a question I should have asked 3 years ago. By dawn, I had read it twice and understood one thing clearly. My dead wife had been smarter than me, braver than me, and more alone than I ever knew. How long does it take a son to sell his sister? And how long before that does he start asking questions about the paperwork? I called my brother Friday morning. Bobby Calloway, 55, a retired forensic evidence technician who still wore latex gloves to sort his mail, answered on the second ring with the grunt of a man who had been expecting bad news since the day he retired from the crime lab. Bobby, I need to ask you something about surrogacy contracts, I said. I kept my voice casual forensic curiosity, nothing personal. From an evidentiary standpoint, what makes one unenforceable? Silence. Not the thinking kind, the remembering kind. The silence of a man reaching back into a conversation he had already had. That's a strange coincidence, Bobby said slowly. Someone asked me the same thing about 6 months ago. Same question, almost word for word. I felt the coffee cool in my hand. Who? Bobby paused again, longer this time. The pause of a man who does not want to say what he is about to say. Derek, my son, my 35-year-old son, who could not close a real estate deal, but had apparently found time to research contract law 6 months before anyone mentioned surrogacy to my daughter. He asked what would make a surrogacy contract unenforceable. Bobby continued. I told him coercion was the primary grounds if there's evidence the carrier was pressured or misled about the terms. He wrote it down, like he was studying for an exam he already knew was coming. I set the coffee on the counter. The mug left a ring on the wood, a small brown circle that Margaret would have wiped before it stained. I did not wipe it. 6 months. Derek had been doing homework on this contract half a year before Thanksgiving. Claire and Ryan had not mentioned surrogacy to anyone. 6 months ago, I would have heard about it. Which meant Derek did not learn about the plan from Claire. He learned about it from the people who were building it. You brothers and sisters out there who have lent money at 3 in the morning without asking why, how many of you ever wondered whether the person you saved was already calculating what you were worth? Claire wired Derek $8,000 in the middle of the night because he called crying. She did not ask a single question, and while she was saving him from a debt he could not name, he was already sitting in meetings with a family that would try to turn her body into an instrument. I stood at the kitchen window. The street was quiet Friday after Thanksgiving, the neighborhood asleep under leftover food, and the slow paralysis of overeating. A cardinal sat on the fence post, where Margaret used to hang a sweet feeder. The bird looked at me, the way birds look at everything without judgment, without memory, without the burden of knowing what people do to each other behind closed doors. I poured the cold coffee into the sink and let the water run until the stains circled the drain. Then I sat down and did what I should have done 3 years ago. I opened the investigation. But first I need to tell you about a woman named Eleanor Bass. 2 months before Thanksgiving, Claire called me at 11 at night. Her voice had the flat, controlled tone she uses after a patient dies, not calm but contained. The way you contain something that would break everything around it if you let it out. "Dad, I lost a patient tonight," she said. "A surrogate, 31 years old. Eleanor Bass, 31, the same age as my daughter. She had been receiving hormone injections without proper medical supervision, a protocol managed not by her own physician, but by the intended family's fertility specialist, who had never examined her in person. Her kidneys failed first, then her liver. By the time Claire's team at the ICU got to her, the damage was systemic and irreversible. Eleanor Bass was 31 years old. Claire is 31 years old. That is not a coincidence. That is a mirror, and I was staring straight into it. She held my hand before she coded. Claire told me that night. Her voice cracked on the word hand, the first and only crack I heard. She said one thing to me. She said, "Never sign anything they give you." I remember asking Claire if she was all right. I remember her saying yes. I remember hanging up and thinking my daughter was shaken by a patient death. The kind of thing that happens in an ICU and never fully leaves you. I was wrong. Eleanor Bass was not just a patient. She was a message. A warning delivered from a dying woman to the next woman in line, and my daughter had received it 2 months before. A cream-colored folder appeared beside the turkey at her own Thanksgiving table. I pulled the contract from my study desk and turned back to the hormone clause, mandatory injections. Dosing schedule determined by the intended mother's specialist. All medical communications routed through Vivian. The same structure that killed Eleanor Bass, unsupervised hormones, no direct physician contact. A surrogate treated as a vessel rather than a patient. This was not a legal game. This was not a family negotiation dressed up in expensive paper. Someone could die. My son had been studying this contract for 6 months. A woman had died in my daughter's arms from the exact procedure it described. And my dead wife had written the doctor's name in a notebook she hid behind a row of law books, because she knew I would not look there until I needed to. 3 threads, 3 directions. All of them pulling me toward the same family in Upper Arlington, sitting in a house full of leftovers, waiting for my daughter to change her mind. She was not going to change her mind, and neither was I. The Harmons were not going to wait for Claire to change her mind. They were going to make the world around her small enough that changing her mind felt like the only door left open. I knew this because I had watched people build cages for 20 years, and the best ones never look like cages. They look like neighborhoods. How many eggs does a woman need to borrow before you realize she is not there for the eggs? Friday afternoon, I drove to Claire's house. She was in the kitchen making soup, the kind of mechanical cooking people do when their hands need something to hold that is not a phone or a fist. I sat at her counter and watched her dice onions with the speed and precision of someone who had spent years cutting under pressure. A knock at the front door. Claire wiped her hands on the dish towel and walked to the entryway. I stayed in the kitchen, angled on the bar stool, so I could see the threshold without being seen from outside. Sandra Briggs stood on the porch, 58 years old, a retired dental hygienist who had moved next door to Claire 2 years ago with a covered dish and a smile that lingered half a second too long. She held an empty egg carton like a prop in a school play. "Claire, honey, I'm so sorry to bother you again," she said, her voice pitched in the warm register of a woman who has practiced being harmless. "I swear my hens have gone on strike. Just 2 eggs if you can spare them." Claire turned toward the refrigerator. In that 3-second window, Sandra's eyes moved, not to the eggs, not to Claire, to the wall calendar pinned beside the pantry, the one with Claire's ICU shift schedule written in blue marker. Then to the shoe rack by the door, 2 pairs of Claire's running shoes, Ryan's pharmacy loafers, no overnight bag, no extra coat. Then to the refrigerator itself, where a pharmacy schedule was pinned with a magnet from a Columbus dentist's office showing Ryan's shifts for the next 2 weeks. Calendar, shoes, schedule. 3 data points collected in 3 seconds by a woman who was supposedly there for eggs. I have watched informants use the same technique for 20 years. Check the perimeter. Note the patterns, report the gaps. Sandra Briggs was not a neighbor. She was an asset, and the person running her was not standing on this porch. You women who have ever had a neighbor who was a little too interested in your schedule, a little too present at your door, trust the feeling in your stomach, because your stomach has better instincts than your manners. Claire handed her 2 eggs. Sandra thanked her with the effusive gratitude of someone performing appreciation rather than feeling it, and walked back across the lawn with the careful pace of a woman who wanted to check the driveway on her way out. "She's been doing that all month, Dad," Claire said, closing the door. "I thought she was just lonely." She was not lonely. She was on assignment. I left Claire's house at 4 o'clock. I drove home with the window cracked despite the cold because I needed the air to keep my thinking sharp. The November wind smelled like frozen earth and chimney ash, and the faint diesel exhaust of a delivery truck passing on the highway. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. That evening, I sat at my desk and ran Sandra Briggs through every database I still had access to: public property records, social media, archives, county voter registration, high school alumni networks. The tools of a retired investigator are slower than an active one's, but they work if you are patient, and patience is the one professional skill I never lost. The results arrived like dominoes. Sandra Briggs lived in the Clintonville neighborhood of Columbus from 1989 to 2022. Linda Harmon lived in the same neighborhood from 1987 to 2005. Same zip code, same grocery store, same 15-year overlap, same high school whetstone class of 1984. Linda and Sandra graduated the same year. Not acquaintances, classmates. Same church charity committee, First Presbyterian Women's Auxiliary, for 8 consecutive years. Not casual members, co-chairs. A conspiracy is not a bomb. It is a garden. Someone plants it years before the harvest, waters it with small favors and covered dishes, and waits until the roots are so deep that pulling them out would destroy the ground they grew in. 2 years ago, Sandra Briggs sold her Clintonville townhouse and moved into the rental next door to my daughter. 6 months before Claire and Ryan's engagement was announced. 6 months before anyone in my family knew the word surrogacy would enter our vocabulary. I mapped the timeline on my desk with a pencil and a legal pad, the same way I mapped evidence for 20 years. Sandra moves in 2 years ago. Derek asks Bobby about contract invalidation. 6 months ago. The contract is printed on expensive paper sometime in the last 3 months. The folder lands on the Thanksgiving table 4 days ago. 2 years of preparation. Sandra was the perimeter, the eyes next door reporting Claire's schedule, her routines, her vulnerabilities, her moments alone. The doctor Margaret had written about was the medical access 3 years of escalating payments buying Claire's reproductive file. The contract was the lock. And my daughter had been living inside a cage for 2 years without knowing the walls were already up, because the walls were made of covered dishes and borrowed eggs and a neighbor who smiled too long. Linda Harmon did not build this conspiracy at a Thanksgiving dinner. She built it the way she built everything early: quiet, and with the absolute confidence of a woman who believed that nobody was watching. Somebody was watching now. I spent Friday night watching. Saturday morning, I stopped watching and started listening because my daughter called at 8 and asked me to meet her at a place where nobody borrows eggs. She was already seated when I arrived, corner booth at Brewer's Tap in Grandview Heights, back to the wall facing the door. I had not taught her that. Or maybe I had. Without knowing it, the way parents teach things by doing them 1,000 times in front of a child who is always paying closer attention than you think. Claire sat across from me with a cup of black coffee and the calm of a woman who had already made her decision before I made mine. Ryan showed me the contract Wednesday night, she said. I set my coffee down. The ceramic was hot against my fingertips, and I held it there, letting the burn keep me steady. I read all 22 pages before he finished his beer, she continued. I didn't sleep, and then I went to Thanksgiving dinner anyway. The noise of the restaurant silverware on plates, a child laughing somewhere near the register, the hiss of the espresso machine shrank to a single point. My daughter had walked into that dining room knowing what the folder contained. She had sat through Gideon's speech and Vivian's performance and Linda's careful placement of the document knowing. And she had not told me. Why, Liz, I asked. Because I needed to know who else was in on it. She wrapped both hands around her mug, the steam curled between her fingers. You can't fight something if you don't know its shape, Dad. You taught me that when I was 12. She was right. I had said those words to her on the front porch after a girl at school had been spreading rumors, and Claire wanted to confront her immediately. I told her to wait to watch, to learn the shape of the problem before swinging at it. She was 12. She listened. 20 years later, she used it on her own family. You parents who have spent years teaching your children how to see the world clearly, there comes a day when they turn that clarity on your own family, and you realize you built a weapon you cannot take back. I watched every person at that table, Claire said. She ticked them off on her fingers, not angrily, not desperately, but with the methodical precision of a nurse charting vitals. Gideon rehearsed his speech. Linda placed the folder. Vivian cried on cue. Ryan stared at his plate because he already knew what was inside. Derek wouldn't look at anyone because he already knew too. And Tully was sweating because he drafted it. She looked at me. Dad, I'm not the victim in this story. I'm the observer. I needed you there because I needed someone else reading the room while I read the document. We were running the same investigation from opposite sides of the table. I took a drink of my coffee. It was bitter and too strong and exactly right. My daughter had done what I would have done, walked into a hostile room with her eyes open and her mouth shut, cataloging threats, measuring alliances, counting the people who looked away. She had learned it from me or from Margaret, or from 12-hour shifts in an ICU, where the difference between a patient who lives and one who dies is whether the nurse catches the thing that everyone else misses. I was proud of her in a way that also terrified me. There's a question we need to answer, I said. Ryan showed you the contract the night before. Why? Claire's hands tightened on her mug. I don't know. Maybe conscience. Maybe a trap. Maybe he wanted to see what I would do so he could report back to his father. What did his face look like when he showed you? She paused. The espresso machine hissed behind the counter. A waitress walked past carrying plates that smelled like bacon and maple syrup, the ordinary sweetness of a Saturday morning that had nothing to do with what we were discussing. His face wasn't sorry, Dad, she said slowly. It was blank, like he was handing me a file and stepping out of the room, like he wanted to be able to say he told me without actually being the one who stopped it. When a man hands you a loaded document the night before a family dinner and says nothing else, is he giving you a warning, or is he making sure his fingerprints are on the mercy and not the crime? I have seen that face before. I have seen it in interrogation rooms and deposition offices and across plea bargain tables, where men sit with their lawyers and calculate which version of the truth costs them the least. Ryan Harmon was not warning his wife. He was not confessing. He was positioning himself to survive no matter which way the wind blew. If Claire signed, he could say he gave her the information. If Claire refused, he could say he tried to warn her. Either way, Ryan walked away clean or clean enough. That is not conscience. That is hedging. And hedging is what people do when they know they are on the wrong side, but lack the courage to cross to the right one. Claire looked at me across her coffee cup. Dad, you taught me how to read people when I was 12. Remember? I remembered. I also remembered that I had never wanted her to use that skill inside her own marriage. Ryan Harmon had shown his wife the contract and then walked into Thanksgiving dinner with the blankest face at the table. That was not a confession. That was a chess move. And I needed to know whose board he was playing on, because in my experience, The man who positions himself to survive every outcome is usually the man standing closest to the person who planned them all. Before I could learn whose board Ryan was playing on, I needed to settle accounts with my own blood. I needed to sit across from my son and ask him a question that would cost us both something we could never get back. I wrote a number on a napkin and slid it across the bar to Derek, the way I used to slide evidence across interrogation tables to strangers. 340,000, his debt. The number that started everything. Derek looked at it. He did not pick it up. He did not push it away. He stared at it with the focused blankness of a man who had been expecting this conversation and hoping it would never arrive. I did not speak first. 20 years taught me that silence is the most effective interrogation tool ever invented. Silence does not argue. It does not accuse. It simply occupies the space where excuses would go and waits for the truth to fill the vacuum. Derek filled it. 2 years ago, he said. His voice was low, stripped of the salesman's polish he wore like aftershave. The accident on Route 33. I wasn't insured properly. The other driver's medical bills. The property damage, the legal fees, $340,000. I couldn't pay it. I couldn't tell you. I couldn't tell Claire. But you could tell Gideon. Derek's jaw worked. He picked up his beer and set it down without drinking. The glass left a wet ring on the bar that expanded slowly the way certain truths expand when you finally set them down. Gideon found out. I don't know how, maybe through Ryan, maybe through his lawyers. He came to me in March. He said the family had a plan that would help Vivian help Claire help everyone. He said all I had to do was stay close to Claire, keep her isolated from outside advice, and make sure she came to Thanksgiving. He paused. He paid me $200,000, direct wire transfer. I used it to settle the worst of the debt. I looked at my son, 35 years old. The boy who fell into the creek behind our house when he was 9, slipped on the mossy bank and went under. Claire was 5. She ran barefoot across the yard and pulled him to the shallows by his shirt collar and screamed until I came running. The emergency room doctor said 3 more minutes and Derek would have drowned. My 5-year-old daughter saved his life with her hands and her voice and her refusal to let go. You fathers who have ever sat across from your own child and realized the person you raise has become someone you would have investigated. You know that the silence between sentences is where the heart breaks. Not loudly, not dramatically. It breaks the way ice breaks on a pond in March, a quiet crack that runs from one side to the other, and by the time you hear it, the surface is already gone. Do you want to tell me the rest? I said, or should I tell you? Derek's eyes closed. When they opened, the salesman was gone. What remained was a man who looked exactly like his mother in the year before she died, exhausted, afraid, and carrying something too heavy for the arms he had. I knew about the hormones from the 2nd month, he said. Ryan told me they were adding something to Claire's supplements. Fertility support, he called it. I knew what it really was. I knew, and I said nothing. The bar smelled like hops and lemon cleaner, and the faint staleness of a room that has absorbed too many confessions on too many Saturday afternoons. A television above the register played a college football game with the sound off. The crowd on screen celebrated in silence, mouths, open arms raised. Joy happening in a world that had nothing to do with this one. I owe Claire my life, Dad, Derek said quietly. She pulled me out of that creek when I was 9. You know that. I know that, I said. I also know that Gideon Harmon paid you $200,000. So I am asking you, what is the price of a life your sister already saved once? Derek did not answer. He did not need to. The answer was sitting in the wet ring his beer glass had left on the bar, a circle with nothing inside it. Then he said something I did not expect. I kept everything. I waited. Every email Gideon sent me, every wire transfer confirmation, every text message with instructions what to say to Claire, when to visit, how to keep her away from outside lawyers. His hands were flat on the bar, fingers spread. From the first day, I kept it because I knew it might come apart, and I needed something to trade if it did. There is a specific kind of cruelty in discovering that the person who betrayed your daughter also holds the key to saving her, and that you need both things from the same hands. Bobby was right. Derek had prepared an escape route. Not out of conscience, Bobby had never used that word. Out of self-preservation. The instinct of a man who knows he is standing in a burning building and keeps one hand on the fire exit at all times. My son had sold his sister. My son had also kept the receipt. Both of those things were true at the same time, and I did not know which one hurt more. I stood up. I put money on the bar for both drinks. Derek looked up at me with the face of a boy who had just fallen into a creek and was waiting for someone to pull him out. I did not pull him out. I walked to the door without touching his shoulder, without putting my hand on his back, without the handshake or the half hug or the squeeze of the arm that I had given him every time we parted for 35 years. For the first time in his life, I left my son without contact. The door closed behind me, and the November air hit my face like a verdict. I sat in my car with the engine off and my hands on the wheel. My son betrayed his sister. My son kept the evidence that could save her. Both were true, and I would have to use the second to fix the first. I drove home from the bar with Derek's confession sitting in the passenger seat like a weight I could not buckle in. My son kept the evidence. My son was also the reason the evidence existed. I would deal with both truths later. That night I had an appointment with my dead wife. I opened Margaret's notebook to page 12, the page where she had written the name of the man who was selling my daughter's medical records for $28,000 a year. Dr. Howard Finch, circled twice in blue ink the way Margaret circled overdue library books on her tracking sheets. Beside the name, a dollar amount with a question mark. And beneath it, in her neat librarian handwriting, the question that had been waiting 3 years for me to read it. Why isn't there Dr. Claire's doctor? Below that line, Margaret had written 3 dates. Appointment dates the days Claire had visited Dr. Finch's office for what she believed were routine checkups. Margaret had tracked them. She had noticed that the Harmon family was steering Claire toward a specific obstetrician, one whose waiting room displayed philanthropy awards from the Harmon Family Foundation. She had not told me because I had dismissed her instinct about Ryan, and she had decided to find the proof herself. I turned the pages slowly. Each one was a small act of investigation, conducted from this desk in this study, while I sat in the next room, reading case files for other people's families. Margaret had cross-referenced public donation records. She had pulled the Foundation's annual reports from the Columbus Library archives. Of course she had. She was a librarian. She had built a timeline. There is a particular cruelty in reading your dead wife's handwriting and realizing she was braver than you. She investigated alone what I dismissed. She asked the questions I should have asked, and she ran out of time 4 months later, not because the questions were wrong, but because her body gave out before her mind did. High blood pressure she had managed for a decade, stress she had absorbed from a secret she carried without help, and a stroke that took her voice before she could use it. "Margaret," I said to the empty room. The furnace hummed. The clock on the mantel ticked the way it had ticked for 31 years of marriage, steady and different, the sound of time passing whether you were ready for it or not. You asked the right question. You didn't have time to find the answer. I do, and I will not waste it the way I wasted yours. I closed the notebook and placed it on the desk beside the contract and Derek's confession and the legal pad where I had mapped the conspiracy's timeline. Then I went to bed. I did not sleep, but I lay in the dark and listened to the house settle and planned what I would do in the morning. Sunday, 9 o'clock, I walked next door. Justice is not a river. It is a man sitting in a house next door for 20 years, with a bourbon glass and a memory that never dulls, waiting for the same name to surface again. Earl Whitmore opened his front door, holding a glass of Woodford Reserve and a copy of the Federal Register. 72 years old. A retired federal judge who still kept his library alphabetized and his hedges trimmed to courthouse precision. He had lived next door to me for 9 years. We shared a property line. A preference for early mornings and the particular friendship of men who have spent their careers inside systems that occasionally fail them. "Earl," I said, "I need to talk to you about a lawyer." He stepped aside without asking which one. That is the advantage of befriending a judge. They assume every conversation is about a lawyer. We sat in his study. The room smelled like leather bindings and the faint sweetness of good bourbon and pipe tobacco that had soaked into the curtains across 2 decades. I told him about the contract. I told him about the folder and the clause and the doctor and the woman who died in Claire's ICU. I told him about Derek and about Margaret's notebook. And then I said a name. Marcus Tully drafted the contract. Earl set down his glass. The sound it made on the oak coaster was small and precise, the sound of a man putting something aside because both hands were about to be needed. "Tully," he said. He repeated the name the way you repeat the name of a fire that burned down your house slowly, with the kind of familiarity that has survived every attempt to forget it. Marcus Tully drafted this contract on Ubas. His name is on the letterhead. He flew in from the airport for the dinner. Earl leaned back in his chair. His eyes went to the bookshelf behind me, the second shelf from the top, where a row of bound case transcripts sat with the spines facing out. He was not looking at the books. He was looking at a memory those books contained. 20 years ago, he said quietly, "I had a case. Trust fraud. Tully wrote the documents. I knew it, the prosecutor knew it, and Tully knew we knew. But the evidence was one signature short." He walked out of my courtroom, and I have not forgotten the sound of his shoes on the marble, Italian leather on federal granite, the sound of a man who got away. He picked up his bourbon again, took a sip, set it down with the deliberation of a man making a ruling. "If you have enough evidence this time, I know exactly who needs to receive it." I looked at Earl Whitmore, 72, retired, bourbon in hand, patience like bedrock. I had a dead wife's notebook, a son's betrayal, archive, a daughter's courage. And now, a retired judge with a 20-year grudge and the contacts to turn evidence into consequences. The pieces were not yet enough, but they were beginning to look like a picture. And the picture had a name on every corner. The picture had names on every corner. Monday morning, I started filling in the center, beginning with the doctor my wife had circled twice in blue ink before she died. How much does it cost to buy a doctor? And how long before you realize he was bought with your daughter's file? Bobby came over at 9 with his laptop and a forensic accountant's instinct for numbers that do not add up. We sat at my kitchen table and pulled public donation records for the Harmon Family Foundation, a charitable entity registered in Franklin County that existed as far as I could tell, primarily to move money from Gideon's pocket to places Gideon wanted it to go. Dr. Howard Finch, Dosip 52, an obstetrician in private practice on the east side of Columbus, appeared in those records with the regularity of a subscription. His waiting room displayed 3 framed philanthropy awards from the foundation. My daughter had sat beneath those frames during her appointments and given that man her complete medical history, believing he worked for her. He did not work for her. 8/14/28, Bobby said, pointing at 3 consecutive annual entries on his screen. He tapped each number with the eraser end of a pencil, his habit when evidence was speaking clearly enough to narrate itself. That's not generosity, that's a pricing structure. Year 1 is the introduction. Year 2 is the commitment. Year 3 is ownership. Someone was buying access, not funding research. 3 years of escalating payments routed through a charitable foundation and landing in the accounts of a doctor who had access to every detail of my daughter's reproductive health, hormone levels, cycle data, fertility assessments, everything the Harmons needed to determine whether Claire was a viable surrogate gathered from a physician she trusted, paid for by a family that was measuring her body like a commodity. He had 3 years of Claire's records, I said. Everything they needed to know, she was viable. Bobby set the pencil down. Everything they needed to plan this, he said quietly. You patients who have ever trusted a doctor with your most private information, have you ever wondered who else has seen that file and what they paid for the privilege? Your medical records are supposed to be a locked room. My daughter's locked room had a key, and Gideon Harmon had purchased it for the price of 3 philanthropy awards and a donation schedule that doubled every year. I stood up and walked to the window. The street was empty except for a mail truck idling at the corner. The December light was thin and gray, the kind of light that makes everything look like evidence, flat shadowless, revealing every crack in every surface. I pressed my palm against the cold glass and held it there until the chill burned through to the bone. Bobby left at noon. I ate a sandwich I did not taste and drank water from a glass that still had a thumbprint from yesterday on the rim. The house was quiet, the way houses are quiet when the person who made them feel inhabited has been gone for 3 years. Monday evening, I sat in my study. Margaret's chair across the room, the reading chair she had positioned beside the lamp so she could grade papers and read novels simultaneously, because Margaret never did one thing when she could do 2. The cushion still held the impression of her weight. I had not sat in that chair since she died. I had not touched it. I had walked past it every day for 3 years, the way you walk past a headstone acknowledging it exists, without getting close enough to read the inscription. How many of you have looked the other way when someone you loved was in trouble? Not because you did not see it, but because seeing it would have required you to do something about it. I mapped my failures on the legal pad. 3 of them. 3 clean, undeniable failures that sat on the page like a confession I had been writing for years, without knowing it. Failure 1, Margaret warned me about Ryan. She said he was too cautious that cautious people hide the math. I investigated for 3 weeks and closed the file because I found nothing I was willing to see. I dismissed my wife's instinct and she spent the last 4 months of her life proving it alone. Failure 2. Ryan's file was thin when I pulled it. Clean financials, clean background, clean references. I closed the investigation because the evidence was insufficient. But insufficient evidence is not the same as absence of evidence. It means you stopped looking. I stopped looking because stopping was easier than finding something that would complicate my daughter's wedding. Failure 3. Derek. My son was drowning in debt, and I saw the signs, the canceled dinners, the empty promises about a sale closing next month. The way he stopped making eye contact across the kitchen table. I chose not to ask. I chose not to ask because asking would have meant confronting the possibility that my son was in the kind of trouble that does not respond to a father's checkbook. 3 times the best detective in the room looked the other way because the subject was someone he loved. 3 times I chose comfort over evidence and called it trust. And 3 times my daughter absorbed the cost. Margaret paid with her silence. Derek paid with his soul. And Claire paid with all of it, the contract, the hormones, the doctor, the dinner. My daughter covered the bill for every time her father chose not to look. I stood up. I walked across the study. And I sat in Margaret's chair for the first time in 3 years. The cushion gave under my weight in a way that felt like being held by someone who was no longer there. It smelled like her hand lotion, cocoa butter, and vanilla, and old library books. The particular smell of paper that has been read so many times, the binding softens and the pages remember the shape of the hands that held them. I made a decision in that chair. I would not fail a 4th time. Not if every name in that notebook had to answer for what they did. Not if every corner of that picture had to be turned face up on a table where the light was bright enough to burn. I woke Tuesday morning in Margaret's chair. My neck ached from sleeping upright, and the study smelled like cold coffee and cocoa butter, and the particular staleness of a room where a man has made a promise to someone who is no longer alive to hear it. The envelope arrived with the 9 o'clock mail. No return address. The handwriting belonged to a man who owed me a favor from 2009, a hospital records clerk I had helped during an insurance fraud case. The kind of favor that never expires because the person who owes it knows you will only call once. I had called Sunday night. He delivered Tuesday morning. Inside the envelope was the reason a dying man had tried to rent my daughter's body. Gideon Harmon, stage 2, pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in April 7 months ago. The oncologist notes were clinical and precise, tumor localized but aggressive, treatment palliative rather than curative prognosis. 18 months with optimal care. I read the report twice at my kitchen table, while the December light came through the window like a blade laid flat across the counter. 18 months. Gideon had approximately 11 months left counting from Thanksgiving to accomplish whatever he needed to accomplish before his body shut down. I pulled public records next. Property assessments, business registrations, the pharmacy chain across 3 Franklin County locations, investment accounts visible through annual filings, real estate holdings. The numbers assembled themselves on my legal pad, the way evidence always assembles itself when you stop looking for what you want and start looking for what is there. The estate was valued at $4.2 million. I set the pencil down. I did the math that Gideon had done months before me, the math Margaret would have done if she had lived long enough to reach this page. A generation-skipping trust requires a living beneficiary. Without a legal grandchild before death, the estate would face federal estate taxes of approximately 40%. $1.68 million, gone to the IRS. The surrogacy contract was never about Vivian wanting a child. Vivian's tears were real. Her infertility was real. But the urgency, the ambush at Thanksgiving, the expensive folder, the penalty clause, the bought doctor, the planted neighbor, that urgency was not about a nursery. It was about a balance sheet. They did not want a grandchild. They wanted a tax receipt that breathed. You listeners who have ever sat in a hospital waiting room beside someone you love, imagine learning that the person dying beside you had already calculated your body's value on a spreadsheet before. The diagnosis was a month old. Imagine discovering that the family dinner was not a gathering, but an appraisal, and the folder beside the turkey was not a gift, but an invoice for services your body had not yet rendered. I gathered the medical records, the financial summary, and the legal pad and walked next door. Earl opened the door in his reading glasses and a cardigan that smelled like pipe tobacco and old wool. I handed him the envelope without explanation. He sat in his leather chair and read the oncologist's report, the way judges read motions once for contempt, once for implication. When he finished, He set the papers on his desk and removed his glasses. That was his tell. Reading glasses on meant the information was interesting. Reading glasses off meant the information had changed the category of the conversation. Generation-skipping trust, he said slowly, requires a living beneficiary. No grandchild, no trust. No trust 40% goes to the IRS. He tapped the medical report with one finger. Gideon is not building a family. He is building a shelter. With my daughter as the foundation, I said. Earl stood and walked to his bookshelf. He pulled a volume of federal tax code, the kind of book that only judges and accountants keep within arm's reach, and opened it to a section he clearly knew by memory. He ran his finger down the page the way a man runs his finger down a list of names he has been waiting to revisit. I have investigated many bad people in 20 years. This was the first time I had to investigate a dying one. And the hardest part was not hating him, because somewhere beneath the spreadsheets and the penalty clauses and the bought physician, a grandfather genuinely wanted to hold a grandchild before the end. That sliver of humanity did not excuse what he had done, but it complicated my anger in a way that made the anger more dangerous, not less. The contract, Earl said, closing the book. The doctor, the penalty clause, the timeline, the estate valuation. He set his glasses on the desk with the deliberation of a man issuing a ruling. This is structured fraud using gestational surrogacy as the mechanism. This is not a family pressuring a daughter-in-law into an uncomfortable favor. This is federal. The word landed in the room like a gavel. Federal, not county court, not family mediation, not a conversation between lawyers over settlement terms. Federal meant IRS investigators. Federal meant criminal referral. Federal meant the kind of scrutiny that does not end when a man dies. It follows the estate, the trust, the co-conspirators, the lawyer who drafted the instrument. What do we need? I asked. Bullmore, Earl said. We need the financial trail complete, every payment, every transfer, every donation that connects Gideon to the doctor. We need someone inside the family who will confirm the motive was fiscal, not emotional. And we need Tully's draft. Because if Marcus Tully knew the purpose of this contract and still drafted it, he is not a lawyer, he is an accessory. Gideon Harmon was dying. He knew he was dying. And he had decided to spend whatever time remained building a cage around my daughter to save himself a sum of money he would never live to spend. Earl looked at me across his desk with the patience of a man who had waited 20 years for a second chance at Tully. We need someone inside that family, he said. Someone who will confirm the motive was money, not love. I already knew who that someone was. I just had not called her yet. I called her Tuesday afternoon from my kitchen, standing beside Margaret's empty chair. Jessie Prescott answered on the first ring and said 3 words. I've been waiting. She had been Claire's best friend for 9 years. 32 years old, a litigation attorney with sharp eyes and an office on High Street, stacked with case files and deposition transcripts. She had been Claire's maid of honor 3 years ago. And for 18 of those months since she had been keeping a secret that could have prevented everything. I drove to her office. She was standing behind her desk when I arrived. Not sitting, standing with a manila folder already in her hands thick enough to matter. The office smelled like printer toner and cold coffee and the particular tension of a room where someone has been rehearsing a confession. 18 months ago, I pulled Gideon Harmon's business filings, she said before I sat down. No small talk, no pleasantries. The words came out the way they come out in depositions prepared, sequential, stripped of everything except fact. Shell transfers between 3 pharmacy LLCs, a foundation that donated exclusively to one physician, a real estate trust with no beneficiary listed. I had questions. I didn't have answers, and I couldn't bring Claire questions without answers not about her husband's family. She set the folder on the desk between us. Her fingertips stayed on it for a moment, as if letting go meant admitting the 18 months were real. She is my best friend, Mr. Calloway. I was her maid of honor. And I sat on this file for 18 months because I was afraid that being wrong would cost me her, and being right would cost her everything. You were right, I said. Jessie's eyes closed for exactly 2 seconds. When they opened, the attorney was gone and the friend was there, exhausted, guilty, and holding an investigation file she had built alone in this office while Claire lived 3 miles away, inside the machine Jessie had been trying to document. I know, she said quietly. That's why I haven't slept in 4 days. How many of you have held a secret about someone you love, not because you did not care, but because telling the truth felt more dangerous than the lie Jesse Prescott had done what I had done. What Margaret had done, what Bobby had done, investigated alone, found pieces of a picture too ugly to show the person standing inside it, and waited. We were a collection of people who had each held one corner of the truth, and none of us had been brave enough to put the picture together until the picture assembled itself at a Thanksgiving dinner. I took the folder. I did not open it there. I told Jessie I would need her legal expertise in the coming days, and that Claire would need her friendship more than her guilt. She nodded. Then she said something that changed the shape of the next 48 hours. "There's someone you should meet. Ryan's younger brother, Ethan. Wednesday, Brewer's Tap. The same corner booth where Claire had told me about the contract 4 days earlier." Jessie sat beside me. Across the table sat Ethan Harmon, 28, an independent bookkeeper who worked from a rented office on 4th Street, the only member of the Harmon family who earned his living without Gideon's permission. He was thin-angular, with the cautious posture of a man who had learned early that relaxation in his family was a luxury that came with a price. He ordered water. He did not touch it. "I was 21, he said. His voice was steady, but his hands were not. His right index finger tapped the edge of the table in a rhythm he probably did not notice. I found a transfer between 2 pharmacy accounts that didn't balance. $43,000 moved sideways through a vendor account that didn't exist. I told my father. "When cease?" He paused. The bar noise filled the gap. Glasses clinking a jukebox, playing something with a steel guitar, the low murmur of other people's ordinary evenings. He thanked me. The next morning he told the family I had been stealing and I was out. 7 years ago. Nobody called me to check. Gideon Harmon did not exile his youngest son for stealing. He exiled him for being honest, which in that family was a far more dangerous crime. Gideon had let Ethan find the irregularity deliberately, then used the discovery as a pretext to remove the one person in the family who would report what he found rather than bury it. "He didn't push me out because I found the fraud," Ethan said, as if reading my mind. "He pushed me out because I'm the kind of person who reports it. He needed to know that about me early. And then he needed me gone." I leaned forward. The booth's vinyl seat creaked beneath me, cold against the backs of my legs through my trousers. The table smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant and old beer. "What do you have?" I asked. "Emails," Ethan said. "Ryan forwarded them to me last year when he was scared. A family thread, my mother, Vivian, my father, discussing the trust timeline, the estate tax deadline, the surrogacy as an instrument. Their words, Mr. Calloway, not mine." He slid his phone across the table. The email chain was 11 messages long, dated across 6 months. I looked at the sender of the first message, the one that started the thread, the one that set the entire conspiracy in motion. It was not Gideon. It was Linda. "Read the top one," Ethan said. His finger stopped tapping. His voice dropped to something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but lived in the space between both. "My mother started this. Not my father. He's dying and she's building. And the woman she's building it on top of is your daughter." How long can a reporter sit on a story before the story starts rotting? I found out on a Wednesday afternoon in December, when I walked into Brewer's Tap on 4th Street and sat across from a woman who had been asking that question for 8 months. Ethan's proof that Linda had authored the first email was still burning in my coat pocket, but I needed something else now. I needed reach. I needed someone who could put pressure on the Harmon Network from a direction they had never prepared for. Lena Marsh was 29 years old, an investigative reporter for the Columbus Independent who wore no jewelry and carried 2 phones. One for sources, one for everyone who was not a source. She had spent 8 months building a file on the Harmon family that was one source away from publication. And when I sat down across from her, the first thing she did was set both phones face down on the table and slide a manila folder toward me. 8 months ago, she said, someone mailed me a photocopy of a medical consent form with Dr. Finch's name on it and a sticky note that said, "Ask who paid for this. I have been asking ever since." And nobody answers. The folder smelled like copier toner and coffee. Inside were billing records, a pharmacy board complaint that had been filed and withdrawn, and 3 photographs of the philanthropy plaques that hung in Finch's waiting room. She had done real work. She had done careful work. But she had hit a wall, and the wall was corroboration. I picked up the consent form. The patient name had been redacted with a black marker, but the procedure code was visible, and so was the date, March of the previous year, 6 months before Vivian's Eve timeline officially began. The anonymous tip was not anonymous to me. Only one person had access to Finch's consent forms and a reason to mail them to a reporter. A former patient who had sat under those philanthropy awards in the waiting room and realized sometime later that they were not awards at all. They were purchase receipts. I looked at Lena across the table. The overhead light caught the rim of her water glass, and the condensation had left a ring on the folder. A good reporter and a good detective share the same affliction. They cannot leave a locked door alone even when every unlocked door in the building is already on fire. I will give you the financial trail, the contract, and the motive, I said. But you hold publication until my daughter is clear. 1 week. She did not blink. 1 week. After that, Mr. Calloway, this story runs whether you are ready or not. I gave her everything. The estate structure, the cancer diagnosis driving the timeline, the escalating payments to Finch, the contract clause that would have trapped Claire. I watched her write in a shorthand I could not read, filling 3 pages in a notebook with a green cover, and when she finished, she closed the notebook and looked at me with the expression of someone who had just been handed the key to a room she had been circling for the better part of a year. Before I tell you who showed up at my door the next evening, if you are still with me right now, I need you to do something. Comment whether you think Ryan Harmon was a willing participant or a victim, and tell me why in 5 words or fewer. Please note what follows includes some recreated details for narrative impact. The truth behind the story is what matters most. Thursday evening. The porch light was on because I had forgotten to switch it off, and the sound of knuckles on my front door came at 7:42. I know the time because I was heating soup on the stove, and the microwave clock was directly in my line of sight. Ryan Harmon stood on my porch in his pharmacy uniform, white coat name badge, rubber-soled shoes that squeaked on the wet wood. He had not called, he had not texted. He had driven 26 minutes from the pharmacy in Westerville to stand on my doorstep and say what he could not say inside his own family's house. I did not invite him in. $280,000, he said. Inventory that moved through accounts I managed but never authorized. My father found it before I did. And he let me know he found it the same week he asked me to support the surrogacy. That was not a coincidence, Mr. Calloway. The December air tasted like wet concrete and wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney. Ryan's breath came out in short, visible bursts. He was not performing. He was confessing. You came to my house, I said. You stood in my kitchen at Thanksgiving and watched my daughter read that contract. I stood in your kitchen because my father told me to stand there, the same way he tells everyone where to stand. He paused. Except now he is dying, and the person giving the orders is my mother. I have spent 20 years dividing the world into 2 clean categories, the people who do harm and the people harm is done to. Ryan Harmon was the first person I had ever met who occupied both categories at the same time, standing on my porch in a uniform that smelled like antiseptic and something closer to shame. Do you still have that email? I asked. He pulled his phone from his coat pocket. September 14th, 4 sentences. He never once used the word threat. He did not have to. I read Gideon's email under the porch light. 4 sentences, no threats, no accusations, no demands. Just inventory numbers, a DEA reporting threshold, and a closing line. Family takes care of family. The most dangerous threat I had ever read, written by a dying man whose wife had already taken over the operation. I forwarded the email to myself and handed the phone back. Ryan's hands were shaking. Mine were not. My son called at 7:14 on a Friday morning, not to apologize, not to explain, not to ask how I was holding up or whether Claire was safe. Derek called to offer me the one thing he had never given anyone in his life, the truth packaged as evidence. The email from Gideon was still sitting in my forwarded inbox, 4 sentences that had kept me awake most of the night. But before I could decide what to do with a dying man's threat, my phone lit up with Derek's name, and I answered because a father answers even when the person calling stopped deserving it months ago. I kept everything, he said. No greeting, no warmth, no breath, wasted on small talk. Every wire confirmation, every email, every instruction Gideon sent me about keeping Claire isolated from the family finances. I kept it because I knew a day like this would come. Not because I am brave, Dad, because I am careful. I stood in my kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear and my free hand flat on the counter. The coffee maker was gurgling behind me. Outside the window, a cardinal sat on the fence post where Margaret used to hang the sweet feeder, and it occurred to me that even the birds had outlasted her. You took their money to help them trap your sister, I said. Yes, and I kept the receipts because I knew the people paying me would eventually need to be stopped. That does not make me good. It makes me useful." He paused and I heard him swallow. "Do you want the files or not?" Bobby had been right. Bobby had told me weeks ago that Derek always left himself an escape route, and here it was, a complete archive of wire transfers, written instructions, and payment confirmations that my son had preserved not out of conscience, but out of self-preservation. He had betrayed Claire and simultaneously built the most damning paper trail against the people who paid him to do it. I want you to sit with that for a moment. If you have children, if you have ever looked at your own son or daughter and believed you understood the full architecture of who they are, consider this. My son sold his sister's autonomy for enough money to cover a debt he never told me about. And then he filed the evidence in a folder labeled insurance on a hard drive he kept in a storage unit on Morse Road. He was not torn. He was organized. "Send the files," I said. He sent them within the hour. 14 documents. I printed every one on the same printer Margaret had bought for her lesson plans, and the ink cartridge was still the one she had installed. And I thought about that longer than I should have. By Friday evening, the kitchen table looked like a field office. Bobby's forensic traces were in a manila folder on the left. Earl's legal framework sat in a binder with blue tabs. Jesse's 18-month investigation file took up the center. Ethan's forwarded emails were stacked beside Lena's anonymous tip documentation. Ryan's blackmail evidence was in a separate envelope I had labeled with the date. And now Derek's insurance archive filled the remaining space. 14 pages that turned my son into both the prosecution's best witness and its most uncomfortable one. 7 sources. 7 people who each held one piece of what the Harman family had built. I had not planned this. I had not recruited them. They had come to me one by one, because the conspiracy had grown too heavy for the people carrying it, and the people crushed beneath it. I sat down with the last item I had not yet finished reading Margaret's notebook. I had been working through it for days. Her careful schoolteacher handwriting, documenting observations she had made about the Harmon family finances. Questions she had written to herself. Patterns she had noticed before anyone else thought to look. But I had not reached the final page. I reached it now. October 15th, 3 weeks before the stroke took her voice. The handwriting was different here. Not the precise print she used for her investigation notes. This was cursive slanted, written quickly. 3 lines. "Tell Walt, don't wait, I'm afraid." I had spent 3 years mourning Margaret, the wife Margaret, the mother, Margaret the woman, who smelled like library paste and lavender, and always left her reading glasses on the bathroom sink. I had never once mourned Margaret the detective who saw everything I missed and wrote it down, because she knew after 32 years of marriage that I was the kind of man who had to find things instead of being told them. 9 words. The last 9 words my wife ever wrote. Not a grocery list, not a lesson plan, not a birthday card for Claire. A warning she intended to give me and ran out of time to deliver. Because 3 weeks later, she was in a hospital bed, and the only sound she could make was my name once before. Even that was taken. I closed the notebook. The kitchen smelled like cold coffee and printer ink. My hands were steady, and that surprised me because the rest of me was not. I did not cry. I had done enough crying for Margaret Calloway. What she deserved now was not my grief. It was my work. I set the notebook beside the 7 stacks of evidence on the kitchen table and picked up my phone. There was only one person who could assemble all of this into something a courtroom would respect. Someone who had spent 20 years on the federal bench and another 2 sharpening a grudge into a legal instrument. Earl answered on the first ring, as if he had been waiting for this call since the day he retired. Ethan Harmon's emails arrived at 6 in the morning, 47 messages forwarded in a single batch, as if he wanted to empty himself of the family before sunrise. I had barely set down the phone from Earl's call the night before he had agreed to come. Monday told me to organize everything chronologically, and hung up with the efficiency of a man who had been waiting decades to dismantle something worth dismantling. Bobby came over at 7 with 2 coffees and a box of latex gloves he still kept from his forensic days. He did not need them for emails, but old habits have their own logic. And I was not going to argue with the only person in my family who had never lied to me. We sat at the kitchen table and began reading. The first thread that stopped us was dated June 14th. Bobby read it aloud because my hands had gone still on the printout. Vivian to Linda. 4 sentences that rewrote everything I thought I understood about the woman who had cried at my dinner table. A 3rd IVF failed. Bobby read. Dr. Adler says there is no viable path. We proceed with the alternative. Please confirm Clause 11. Language ensures the child meets specifications. He set the page down and looked at me. She knew 6 months before Thanksgiving. The crying at dinner was an act. I picked up the email and read it again. The words did not change. Vivian Harmon had received a definitive medical verdict in June. No viable path. Her doctor had closed the door. And instead of grieving, Vivian had pivoted to the next phase of a plan that was already in motion. She had not come to our Thanksgiving table as a heartbroken woman desperate for a child. She had come as an architect reviewing the construction site. I called Ethan. He picked up on the second ring, and his voice had the flat quality of someone who had not slept. Vivian's spa does over $300,000 a year, he said. She is not a desperate woman. She is an investor. And Clause 11 was her idea, not my father's, not Tully's, hers. 3 rounds of IVF. Nearly $200,000 spent on treatments she already knew would fail, because the treatments were never the plan. They were the alibi. Every failed round built the narrative of a grieving, desperate woman, and every dollar spent purchased another layer of sympathy that she could deploy at a dinner table full of people who did not know they were watching a performance. Bobby pulled 6 more emails from the stack and arranged them by date. I poured coffee that had gone cold and drank it anyway because the taste of something bitter felt appropriate. By noon, Jessie arrived with her own copy of the emails. Ethan had forwarded them to her as well, and a yellow legal pad, already half full of notes. She spread the remaining messages across the table in chronological order, and what emerged was not a conspiracy. It was a blueprint. Linda to Derek March, Jessie said, touching each page as she named it. Linda to Finch's office April. Linda to Ryan about the hormone schedule May. Linda to Vivian, confirming Clause 11. June, Linda to Sandra about monitoring Claire's routine. July. She straightened up and looked at me. Every operational decision traces back to one sender. Gideon is the money. Linda is the mind. The kitchen was quiet except for the refrigerator humming and the occasional car passing on the street outside. Bobby stood at the counter with his arms crossed. Jessie stood at the table with her legal pad. I sat in the chair Margaret used to sit in, surrounded by 47 emails that all pointed to the same woman. Every family has an architect and a contractor. One draws the plans, the other swings the hammer. And the most dangerous families are the ones where the architect looks like she is only there to pour the coffee. I had sat across from Linda Harmon at 3 family dinners. She passed the bread. She complimented Margaret's china pattern. She asked about my retirement with the gentle interest of a woman who had no agenda beyond politeness. And the entire time, she was constructing a system designed to use my daughter's body to shelter an estate from taxation. She never raised her voice above the volume of someone asking for the salt. This is not a dying man's desperation, Jessie said. This is a 60-year-old woman's business plan. Gideon is the excuse. Linda is the reason. I looked at the table. Bobby's forensic notes on the left, Earl's legal framework in the binder, Jessie's investigation file in the center, Ethan's emails fanned across every remaining surface, Lena's documentation, Ryan's forwarded threat, Derek's insurance archive, and now threaded through all of it like a signature written in invisible ink, Linda's fingerprints on every decision, every recruitment, every timeline. She had approached Derek first. She had selected Finch from a list of 3 doctors. She had instructed Ryan on hormone timing. She had placed Sandra Briggs in the house 3 doors from Claire. She had done all of this while her husband signed the checks and took the phone calls and sat at the head of the table, looking like the man in charge. 47 emails, 1 architect. Every line of evidence pointed to the woman who had never signed a document, never left a fingerprint on anything except a dinner invitation, never once been suspected by anyone in the room. Linda Harmon had built this conspiracy the way she built everything, quietly, completely, and with the absolute confidence of someone who had never been caught. I picked up the phone to call Earl back, but Bobby was already reaching for his coat. He knew where I was going next. 3 doors down, Sandra Briggs's front porch. The spy who had been watching my daughter's house for months, reporting everything to the woman who had designed everything. The worst thing I learned that Saturday evening was not that my daughter had been chosen. It was that she had been chosen second after the first woman was smart enough to say no. Sandra Briggs had not answered her door. Bobby and I stood on her porch for 3 minutes, knocked twice, and watched the living room curtain move without anyone appearing behind it. She was home. She was hiding. That told me everything her words would have, so we walked back to my kitchen, where Lena Marsh was waiting, with the last piece of her 8-month investigation. 14 months ago, Lena said Gideon approached another woman, 26 healthy, no family connection to the Harmons. He offered $120,000. She refused. Lena set a single sheet of paper on the table. 2 weeks after her refusal, $45,000 appeared in her account, with a one-page NDA. She signed because the alternative was a man with 3 lawyers and a pharmacy empire. Her name is in my notes, but I promised her anonymity, and I intend to keep that promise. Claire was sitting in Margaret's chair. She had come over an hour earlier after I called and told her she needed to hear something in person. She had not spoken since Lena began. Now she looked at the paper on the table, the way you look at something that has just reclassified your entire existence. "They shopped for me," she said. The kitchen faucet dripped. The clock on the stove read 6:47. Outside, the streetlight had come on early because of the overcast sky, and it threw a yellow rectangle across the linoleum that touched the edge of Claire's shoe. "They shopped for someone they could control," I said. "You were not special to them, sweetheart. You were convenient. And that is the part that should make you angry, not sad." She did not cry. She nodded once slowly the way her mother used to nod when she had finished processing something and was ready to act. I had not seen that gesture in 3 years, and seeing it on Claire's face almost broke me in a way that none of the evidence had. If you have a daughter, imagine learning that someone evaluated her the way a bank evaluates collateral, not for who she is, but for how difficult she would be to replace if she refused. Not a daughter-in-law, not a member of the family, a vendor selected for maximum compliance and minimum exit routes after the first vendor had the leverage to walk away and the good sense to use it. Claire was chosen because she was married into the family, which meant refusing would cost her the marriage. Because she was an ICU nurse working 12-hour shifts, which meant she had no time to investigate. Because her father was a retired PO, who everyone assumed had stopped paying attention. They were wrong about the last part. They were catastrophically wrong. Lena left at 8. Claire stayed. She fell asleep on the couch under the blanket Margaret had crocheted during her last winter. And I sat in the kitchen with the evidence spread across every surface and listened to my daughter breathe in the next room and did not sleep at all. Sunday morning. Earl arrived at 9 with a leather briefcase that looked like it had survived the federal judiciary and 2 decades of retirement. Bobby was already at the table with coffee. I walked to the hallway closet, reached behind the winter coats, and unlocked the bottom drawer of my desk. How long does it take to build a case against the people who married into your family? I can tell you exactly. It takes 6 months of active investigation, 7 sources who came forward one at a time, a wife who saw it before anyone else and wrote it down, and a locked drawer that I had been adding to since before Claire's wedding. I set the dossier on the table. Earl opened it. The blackmail email, the 47 family threads, Tully's draft contract, Bobby's transfer records, the escalating payments to Finch, Derek's insurance archive, Lena's silence money documentation, and at the bottom, Margaret's notebook with its final 3 lines still visible through the worn cover. "A financial fraud," Earl said, turning pages. "Medical ethics violations, coercion, blackmail, witness tampering through silence payments, contract fraud, and at the center, a generation-skipping trust designed around a child who does not yet exist." He looked up. "You built this like a federal case." "I started it before the wedding," I said. The words tasted like cold pennies in my mouth. Margaret's notebook gave me the instinct, but instinct is not evidence. It took 6 months, 7 sources. And my wife dying before I had enough to open this drawer and call it proof. Bobby set his coffee down. The mug made a small sound against the wood. "What happens now?" Earl closed the folder and placed it flat on the table between us. "This is enough, more than enough, but none of it matters unless Claire says yes. This is her body, her marriage, her name on every document. She decides whether we fight or we walk, nobody else." I looked at Bobby. Bobby looked at the floor. We both understood what Earl was really saying. The only person who could authorize this fight was the one person who would lose the most by fighting. And she was sitting in the next room on the couch where she had slept under her mother's blanket, listening to every word through a door I had forgotten to close. Claire said one word through the open door: "Fight." She did not step into the kitchen. She did not sit down. She stood in the doorway with her mother's crocheted blanket still over her shoulders and said the word like it was a verdict she had already deliberated on while we were still assembling the jury. By Sunday afternoon, 4 envelopes sat on Earl Whitmore's dining table, each addressed to a different institution, each containing enough to end a different career. Earl's house smelled like pipe tobacco and furniture polish, the scent of a man who had lived alone since his wife passed and kept everything exactly where she had left it. His dining table was mahogany long enough for 8 chairs, and we used every inch of it. Bobby stood at one end, printing duplicate copies on Earl's home printer. Jesse sat in the middle, organizing cover letters with the precision of someone who had spent 18 months preparing for this moment. Lena stood by the window, reading through the complete file one final time, with both phones face down on the sideboard. Earl distributed the folders with the calm efficiency of a man who had spent 2 decades issuing sentences from a federal bench. Lena gets the narrative, he said. Medical board gets Finch, Bar Association gets Tully, the IRS gets the trust fraud, 4 institutions, 4 filing deadlines. Maced is 4 people who cannot pretend they did not receive this. He tapped the table once. By Monday morning, the Harmon machine has 4 fronts to defend and the resources to cover maybe 2. Jessie looked up from her cover letters. Once Lena publishes, Linda cannot claim ignorance. Once the medical board opens Finch's file, his license is suspended pending review. Once the bar sees Tully's draft, his practice is under investigation. And once the IRS sees the trust timeline, the estate plan collapses, whether Gideon is alive or dead. I stood at the end of the table nearest the kitchen and watched them work. I had spent 20 years as a private investigator, and I had never once gone to the press, the licensing boards, or the IRS. I had always believed in keeping things quiet, handling problems within the scope of what one man and one file could accomplish. But I had also never investigated a family that had bought a doctor, blackmailed a son, bribed my own boy, and tried to rent my daughter's body for a tax strategy. 4 envelopes is not justice. 4 envelopes is a controlled demolition, and the only difference between demolition and destruction is whether you planned where the building would fall. Bobby sealed the last envelope with a strip of packing tape that squeaked against the paper. Jessie signed her name on each cover letter in blue ink. Lena put the complete file into her bag without ceremony, the way someone pockets a key they have been waiting to use. Earl walked to his study and made a single phone call to a federal liaison, whose name he did not share with the rest of us. When he came back, he poured 5 glasses of water from a pitcher on the sideboard, and we drank in silence, and the water tasted like nothing, which was exactly right. The envelopes went out by courier that evening. 3 packages to 3 offices, 1 digital file to Lena's editor. By the time I drove home, the streetlights on Earl's block had come on, and the December dark had swallowed the lawns. And I thought about Margaret's notebook sitting in that file, and how she had started this investigation from a kitchen chair, while I sat in the next room, watching the evening news oblivious. Monday, the phone rang at 11:14 in the morning. Ethan, his voice was flat, the kind of flat that comes after you have felt everything, and arrived at the place where feeling stops. I showed them everything, he said. The emails, the payment trail, the trust timeline. I laid it on the dining room table and stood there while they read it. I leaned against the kitchen counter. The house was quiet. Claire had gone to work the overnight shift, and Bobby was at home waiting for my call. My mother looked at the papers. Ethan continued. She read every page. Then she looked at me and said 4 words. Family takes care of family. The same words my father uses. The same words that mean we own you. And Vivian, I asked. Vivian didn't speak. She looked at Clause 11. She looked at me, and she closed her mouth like a door. Then Ethan Harmon was 28 years old and sitting in a driveway he would never pull into again. The youngest son of a family that measured loyalty in silence and punished honesty with exile. He had been pushed out at 21 for finding an irregularity nobody wanted found, and now, 7 years later, he had walked back into that house with the full accounting of what his family had built and watched 2 women choose silence over explanation. I am not going back inside that house, Mr. Calloway, he said. Not today, not ever. You don't have to, I said. He hung up. I stood in the kitchen holding a phone that still carried the sound of a car engine idling in a driveway on the east side of Columbus. 4 institutions had received 4 envelopes. One son had walked out of one family for the last time. And somewhere in that house, Linda Harmon was sitting with evidence spread on her dining table and a silence around her that did not sound like surrender. It sounded like calculation. Because women who build conspiracies in silence do not collapse in silence. They recalculate. And Linda Harmon had been recalculating longer than any of us had been paying attention. Marcus Tully was already standing when we walked into his office, not behind his desk, but in front of it. as if he had been waiting on the wrong side of his own authority for 20 years and had finally run out of room to pretend otherwise. Linda's recalculation came faster than I expected. By Tuesday morning, Sandra Briggs had packed 2 suitcases and left Grandview Heights without forwarding her mail. Linda was cleaning house. But she was too late because the envelopes had already arrived, and institutions do not forget what they have opened. Tully's office smelled like leather chairs and the lemon oil his secretary used on the bookshelves. Earl stood to my left with his briefcase. Tully stood in front of his desk with his hands at his sides and a look on his face that I recognized from 2 decades of watching guilty men decide how to frame their cooperation. Gideon brought me a hormone addendum in August, Tully said. He did not sit, neither did we. Administer fertility medication through Ryan's Pharmacy Access, without Claire's knowledge or consent. He paused. I told him I would not sign it. He told me I was fired. I kept the draft with my refusal dated and notarized. Because I have practiced law long enough to know that the document you refuse to sign is the one that saves you. He walked to his filing cabinet, unlocked the second drawer with a key he wore on a chain around his wrist, and pulled out a single manila folder. Inside was a 2-page addendum with Gideon's handwriting in the margins, and Tully's refusal stamp in red ink at the bottom, dated August 19th, notarized. Witnessed by his paralegal, the kind of document a careful man creates when he senses the ground shifting beneath the client who pays his retainer. Earl took the folder and read it standing up. His face did not change, but his grip on the pages tightened, and I could hear the paper crease under his thumbs. 20 years ago, you drafted a contract I could not touch, Earl said. Today you are handing me proof that the Harmons knowingly pursued non-consensual medication after their own lawyer refused to authorize it. He closed the folder. This is not about me bringing you to light, Marcus. This is about you bringing yourself to light before someone less patient does it for you. Tully nodded once. He did not argue. He did not negotiate. He understood the arithmetic: cooperate now and survive, or wait and be included in the wreckage. If you have ever watched a powerful man sit across from a truth more powerful than his reputation, you know what his face looks like. It looks like relief dressed as defeat. Because the weight of carrying the secret was always heavier than the cost of releasing it, and Tully had been carrying his since August. We left his office with the addendum in Earl's briefcase. The elevator doors closed, and Earl looked at me in the mirrored walls and said, "That is the last piece. Criminal non-consent. Everything else was financial or ethical. This is criminal." The consequences arrived the way Earl had designed them. Not all at once, but in sequence, each one triggering the next, like dominoes arranged across a table. Tuesday, the IRS opened a formal fraud investigation into the generation-skipping trust and froze the estate transfer. Every dollar locked in place by a federal hold that no attorney in Columbus could lift, without a hearing that would take months to schedule. Wednesday, the state medical board issued a temporary revocation of Dr. Finch's license. His office closed. The philanthropy plaques stayed on the walls of an empty waiting room, and I wondered how many patients would walk past that building and finally understand what those plaques had purchased. Thursday, Linda Harmon received a summons. Criminal investigation into the administration of hormone medication without the patient's informed consent. The summons was served at the Harmon residence by a county deputy, who later told Jesse that Linda accepted the papers without a word, signed the receipt, and closed the door. 4 days, 4 institutions. The machine Linda had built in silence was dismantled by paperwork, the same instrument she had used to construct it. The estate was frozen. The doctor was suspended. The architect was under criminal investigation. The lawyer had turned witness. The youngest son had walked away. And the dying man at the center of it all received notification from his replacement attorney that the trust was dead. He would spend his remaining months with every asset locked behind a federal hold, and his wife facing charges that carried actual prison time. I sat in my kitchen on Friday evening and drank coffee that had gone cold for the second time that week. The house was quiet. Bobby had gone home. Claire was working the night shift. The evidence that had covered every surface of my kitchen table for weeks was gone, now distributed to 4 institutions and 1 reporter, and the table was bare except for Margaret's empty chair and a ring stain from a mug I had not washed. Lena's article ran without names. She did not need them. In a city the size of Columbus, a story about a pharmacy chain owner, a surrogacy contract, and a doctor on retainer narrowed the field to 1 family. The town knew by Friday. The Harmons knew the town knew by Saturday. I should have felt victory. I had built this case from a kitchen table with 7 sources and a dead wife's notebook, and every target had fallen in the order Earl predicted. Instead, I felt the thing that comes after victory in every investigation I have ever closed. The quiet recognition that the people who lost the most were not the ones who deserved to. Gideon was dying anyway. Linda would hire lawyers, Finch would appeal, Tully would cooperate and walk. But Claire had lost a marriage, a family, a future she thought was hers, and a version of herself that believed people married into your life because they loved you, not because you were the second name on a list. My son arrived on a Tuesday with the posture of a man who had rehearsed an apology all night and then decided at the door that an apology was not what he owed me. Claire had filed the paperwork with Jesse's firm the day before. The marriage was ending. The investigation was over. The institutions were doing their work. And now Derek stood in my doorway with his coat still zipped and his car running in the driveway, as if he wanted to be certain he could leave quickly if what happened inside went badly. "And sit down," I said. He sat at the kitchen table in the chair Bobby usually took. The table was bare now. All the evidence was gone, distributed to the people and offices that would use it. What remained was a kitchen that smelled like dish soap and the December draft that came through the window Margaret had always said needed replacing. Derek did not start with the money. He started with the hormones. "I knew from the second month," he said. His hands were flat on the table palms down the way someone presses their fingers to a surface when they need to feel something solid. Ryan told me they were adding something to Claire's supplements. I told myself it was vitamins. I knew it was not vitamins. I told myself anyway, because the alternative was admitting I had sold my sister's health, along with everything else. He talked for 20 minutes, the accident debt, the approach from Gideon, the wire transfers, the instructions to keep Claire away from the family's financial conversations. The Thanksgiving dinner, where he stood in this kitchen and watched his sister read a contract designed to control her body, and said nothing because saying something would have cost him the money that was already paying down a debt he had never told me about. I listened to every word. I did not interrupt. I did not raise my voice. I did not leave the room. I sat across from my son and let him empty himself of 6 months of complicity, the way Ethan had emptied 47 emails in a single batch. Because confession only works if the person hearing it stays in the chair. When he finished, the kitchen was quiet. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed on the street outside. I could taste the coffee I had drunk an hour earlier, bitter and metallic at the back of my throat. How many of you have sat across from someone you love and realized that the thing you need to say is not, "I forgive you, but I am not ready to forgive you, and I love you anyway." And those two things will have to share the same room until one of them figures out how to leave. "You knew about the hormones and stayed silent," I said. "That was not weakness, Derek. Weakness is not knowing what to do. You knew exactly what to do and chose not to do it. That is a choice. Do you understand the difference?" He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He closed it. His eyes were wet, but he did not cry, and I recognized that restraint because it was mine. He had learned it from watching me. And in that moment, I was not sure whether I had taught him discipline or just taught him how to hold things in until they rotted. "You do not need the answer today," I said, "but you need to find it. And when you find it, you bring it to your sister, not to me." He nodded. He left. The car in the driveway pulled away, and I stood at the window and watched my son drive down the street where he had learned to ride a bicycle. And I wanted to forgive him the way you want water, after a long illness desperately physically, in a place beneath language. But forgiveness without understanding is just permission, and I would not give Derek permission to remain the man who knew about the hormones and said nothing. Monday night, Jessie called and told me what happened at her apartment. She had invited Claire over. Ethan was already there, sitting in the corner of her living room with a glass of water he never drank. Jessie told Claire the truth. She had built the investigative file 18 months ago. She had enough to ask questions and chose not to ask them because she was afraid of what the answers would do to Claire's marriage. She chose comfort over safety, and she said those words exactly. Because Jessie Prescott was the kind of lawyer who believed that precision in language was a form of respect. Claire was silent for a long time. Jessie said she could hear the radiator clicking in the hallway and the neighbor's television through the wall. Then Claire spoke. "You cannot know everything, Jessie. Nobody can. And now you are here. That is the part that counts." Ethan stood up from the corner. His voice was steady but thin, the voice of a 28-year-old who had walked out of his family twice and was still learning what to build in the space they left behind. "My family did this to you," he said. My father signed the checks, my mother drew the plans, my brother administered the hormones, my sister-in-law wrote the clause. I cannot apologize for any of them. They would not want me to, but I can be a witness, and I will be. Forgiveness is a house with many rooms, and the room most people never find is the one where you stop waiting for the apology to be good enough and start building with whatever materials showed up at the door. 3 people sat in that apartment: a friend who waited too long, a brother who left too early, a woman who survived something none of them prevented. They did not forgive each other. They did something harder. They chose to keep going in the same direction. Claire called me at 11 that night. She did not say she was okay. She said something that cost her more. I am filing for divorce on Thursday, Dad, and I need you to be there, not as a detective, not as the man who built the case, as my father. I said yes before she finished the sentence because it was the first time in 6 months she had asked me for something I actually knew how to give. What do you say to the man who put hormones in your supplements, showed you the contract that proved his family's intentions, and then stood in your kitchen pretending to be your husband for 3 more months? I drove Claire to the house in Upper Arlington on Thursday morning. She asked me to wait in the car. I did. I sat in the driveway with the engine off and the heater dying and my hands on the steering wheel, being her father, which was what she had asked me to be, and which turned out to mean sitting still while she walked into the hardest conversation of her life without me. She told me afterward what happened inside. They sat at the kitchen table, their kitchen table, the one they had picked out together at a furniture store on Sawmill Road the week after they moved in. Ryan was already seated when she came through the door. He did not stand. He did not reach for her. I made a choice, he said. I knew it was wrong when I made it, and I made it anyway. I am not going to sit here and tell you I was only afraid, I was afraid, and I was weak. And those are 2 different things, and I chose to be both. Claire sat across from him. The kitchen smelled like the dish soap they both used and the coffee he had brewed and not drunk. She could hear the neighbor's dog barking through the wall, a sound she had listened to every morning for 3 years without thinking about it. Why did you show me the contract the night before Thanksgiving? She asked. Ryan looked at the table. I do not know. Maybe I wanted you to see me as less of a monster. Maybe I wanted you to say no so it could be over without my fingerprints on the refusal. He paused. I do not know which one is true. Maybe both. That is not sufficient, Claire said. But at least it is the truth. They sat for 40 minutes. No shouting, no crying. 2 people who had shared a bed for 3 years, looking at each other across a kitchen table and discovering that the distance between them could not be measured in feet, only in the number of lies that had accumulated in the space where love was supposed to be. If you have ever sat across from someone who hurt you and heard them say something that was not enough but was at least honest, you know that truth without resolution is the hardest thing to carry. You cannot put it down. You cannot use it to build anything. You can only hold it and walk forward and hope that the weight eventually changes shape into something you recognize. Claire came back to the car at 10:15. She closed the door. She did not look at the house. I started the engine and pulled out of the driveway. And neither of us spoke until we were on the freeway. And then she said, he was honest, finally, and it was not enough, and I think he knows that. I drove her to my house. She went upstairs to the room that had been hers before she married, and I heard the door close. And I stood in the kitchen alone with the question I had carried for 3 years pressing against the inside of my chest like a second heartbeat. Did they kill her? Did Margaret's investigation cost her more than silence? Did the stress of knowing what the Harmons were planning contribute to the stroke that took her voice and then her life? Was my wife murdered by proximity to a secret she could not share? I picked up the phone and called Dr. Adeline Cross at Riverside Methodist. She had been Margaret's physician for 11 years. I told her why I was calling. She pulled the file. Pre-existing hypertension, she said. Stage 2, managed with medication for a decade. The stroke was consistent with uncontrolled blood pressure compounded by prolonged stress. There is no evidence of external cause, no toxicology flags, no anomalies in her blood work from the last 3 visits. Could the stress have been a factor? I asked. That stress is always a factor in hypertensive stroke. But the underlying condition was the primary cause. The stress accelerated what was already happening. 3 years I had carried that question. Did they kill my wife? And the answer was no. They did not poison her. They did not sabotage her medication. They did not arrange her death. But they made her afraid enough to write 3 words she never got to say. and the fear she carried in silence sat on top of a blood pressure condition that was already running out of margin. Nobody killed Margaret, but somebody made the last months of her life heavier than they needed to be, and she bore that weight alone because I was the kind of man she had to leave evidence for instead of talk to. I closed the notebook. I set it on the shelf beside our wedding album and the photograph of Claire in her nursing school graduation cap. 3 women across 2 frames and 1 notebook. I had failed all of them at one point or another, and I was still here, and that was either grace or accident, and I no longer needed to know which. The first snow fell on Grandview Heights at 11:40 that night. Margaret always loved the first snow. She said it made the world look like it was being forgiven for the year it just had. I watched it from her chair by the window. The flakes caught the streetlight and turned orange for a moment, before they landed on the lawn and turned white again. The house was quiet. The investigation was finished. My daughter was upstairs in her childhood bed. And somewhere between the case being over and the family not being over, I would have to learn how to be a father again, instead of a detective, starting Thursday. Starting with showing up at a courthouse where the only evidence that mattered was that I was there. 6 weeks after Thanksgiving, my daughter sat at my kitchen table holding a cup of tea with both hands. And for the first time in months, I saw Claire instead of a case. I had gone to the courthouse with her on Thursday. I sat on a wooden bench in a hallway that smelled like floor wax and recycled air, and watched her walk through a door with Jesse at her side and come out 40 minutes later with a filing number and a face that looked like it had been scrubbed clean of something heavy. She did not cry. She took my arm in the parking lot, and we walked to the car in silence, and the silence was not the kind that hides things. It was the kind that comes after you have said everything that needed saying to everyone except the person standing next to you. Now it was January. The holidays had passed quietly. Bobby came for Christmas dinner. Claire helped me cook. We used Margaret's recipe for the potatoes, and neither of us mentioned it, and both of us noticed. Claire sat in the 3rd chair from the window, the one with the wobble that Margaret never fixed because Claire said it made breakfast feel like a boat. She was 31 years old, an ICU nurse, divorced, surviving, and drinking chamomile tea at her father's table, like a woman who had decided the next chapter would be written in her own handwriting. "Did you know beforehand that I would be all right?" she asked. The kitchen was warm. The radiator ticked against the baseboard. Outside, January had turned the lawn gray, and the sky the color of old paper, and a cardinal sat on the fence post where the sweet feeder used to hang. "No," I said. "I did not know you would be all right. I knew I would not leave you alone if you were not. That is different. That is not certainty. That is just presence." And it was the only thing I had left to offer after I ran out of evidence. She smiled. It was small and tired and real. "Mom would have found it sooner," she said. "Your mother found it first. I just took 3 years to read what she wrote." That sounds like her, leaving the answer where you would eventually look. I spent 6 months looking at my daughter through the lens of an investigation. I cataloged her as a victim, a witness, a plaintiff, a piece of a case I was building on a kitchen table covered in manila folders. And the moment I stopped, the moment I saw her holding tea with both hands at the table where she learned to read, I understood that the case was never the point. The case was just the road back to being allowed to sit across from her without a folder between us. Claire left at noon. She hugged me at the door, and her coat smelled like the lavender detergent Margaret used to buy. And I did not ask her if she had chosen it on purpose, because some questions are better left as gifts. I stood at my desk after she left. The bottom drawer was open, empty. Every document filed, delivered, or returned. 6 months of evidence that had filled every surface in this house was gone now, distributed to institutions and attorneys and a reporter with 2 phones. And what remained was a drawer with nothing in it, and a man standing over it trying to remember what he used to keep there before the investigation started. I thought about Gideon Harmon, not the dying man with frozen assets and a wife under criminal investigation. The man I met at the Kroger on 5th Avenue last August. He was buying grapefruit. I was buying coffee. We stood 3 feet apart in the produce aisle, and he looked at me 1 second longer than a stranger would. In that second, I saw the calculation. He knew what I had been. He knew whose father I was, and he decided between the grapefruit and the organic bananas that a 60-year-old widower would choose peace over truth, because that is what tired fathers do. They let things go. They look away. They decide that the marriage is more important than the question. He was wrong, not because I am brave, because Margaret taught me in a notebook I found 3 years too late that peace built on silence is just a longer word for cowardice. And cowardice was the one thing she never tolerated, not in her students, not in her children, and not in me. If you are listening to this, and you know something about someone you love that you are afraid to say it. Say it badly. Say it too late. Say it in a notebook they will not find for 3 years. But say it, because families survive truth. They do not survive the silence that replaces it. The silence does not protect anyone. It just gives the people doing harm more room to operate, and the people being harmed less reason to ask for help. 3 times I failed my daughter during this investigation. I will carry those 3 times for the rest of my life. But the drawer is empty now. The notebook is on the shelf beside our wedding album. The evidence has been delivered to people whose job is to act on it. And my daughter sat at my kitchen table this morning and held her tea with both hands and asked me a question that had nothing to do with contracts or hormones or money. And I answered it as her father. That is not redemption, but it is a start. I closed the empty drawer. I stood at the kitchen window where Margaret used to watch the snow and Claire used to eat cereal in a wobbling chair. And I said the thing I should have said 3 years ago to a woman who was no longer in the room, but who had never really left it. I read your notebook, Margaret, every word, and you were right. True peace comes only after truth, never as a substitute for it. And to you listening to my story, remember this. I spent 6 months building a case from a kitchen table. I found the evidence, I exposed the conspiracy, I protected my daughter. But I also spent 3 years ignoring what my wife tried to tell me. And I spent 6 months looking at my own child through the lens of an investigation instead of through the eyes of a father. Do not make my mistake. Do not wait for a folder on a dinner table to start paying attention to the people you love. This family story taught me that silence is not protection, it is permission. Every family story has a moment where someone knows the truth and chooses not to speak it, and that silence grows until it becomes the architecture of something ugly. If you know something, say it. Say it badly, say it too late, but say it, because families survive truth. They do not survive the silence that replaces it. I believe God put me through this so I could stand here and tell you. True peace comes only after truth, never as a substitute for it. That is the lesson my wife left in a notebook I found 3 years too late, and it is the lesson I am leaving with you right now. If this family story stayed with you, I would be grateful if you shared it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment and tell me what would you have done at that Thanksgiving table. Would you have opened the folder or walked away? I read every single one. And if you have not already, please subscribe to Revenge Dad so you do not miss what comes next. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. Please remember that certain details in this story have been adjusted for narrative and emotional impact. The message behind it, that truth is the only foundation a family can stand on, is what I hope stays with you long after you close this video. God bless you all.